we are missing a interpreter, but I'm hoping he will come back in a moment. And we're a really small group, so feel free to come forward and we'll just have a little bit of a chat. Here we go. My name, feel free to come on up. There's only a few of you guys, so welcome. I think we are certainly really excited about this discussion. My name is Nicole Martini. I work for the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the International Secretariat, on environmental governance and conflict. And this panel is, I think, grappling with a really tricky nexus of two already quite challenging issues, and that is sort of how campaign finance is derived in various contexts from environmental degradation, and looking at the harm this does, of course, to nature, but also then what it does to people, to human rights, and also the implications it has for political dispensations themselves, for the integrity of democracies as well. You will note we have a very large panel. We may have broken the record, which is, I think, as much as anything shows the breadth of this topic and I think how far-reaching its implications are. I'm really grateful that these colleagues were willing to come together and talk about, what is a really challenging and sometimes sensitive topic, and in particular to two organizations that were involved in co-organizing it, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems and the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center. And I think when we were first conceptualizing this discussion, we were talking about this recognition that corruption, I think this came up in earlier sort of sessions, but corruption is a symptom of a problem, and trying to understand what some of those root causes are and what are those powerful vested interests that create these perverse incentives for corruption. And we felt very much like this angle of campaign finance, of political finance, was a key piece of that, looking how that influences powerful interests, and that was an important facet if we do want to have a conversation about prevention. So with that, I think our panel will talk about sort of three key exam questions. We'll spend a little time at the beginning really trying to contextualize what this problem is, what does it look like, what are we talking about, and then we'll try to then spend a chunk of time looking at specific contexts. How does this manifest in different arenas around the world and country contexts? What are the implications? Why does that matter? And then, hoping to leave on a somewhat optimistic or action-oriented note, we will spend some time also talking about what are the potential pathways for change to start to shift those incentives, and how can we nudge those forward? And hopefully you are all very excited at this late time in the day and will want to ask us lots of questions at the end too. So before we sort of get started, I thought, we thought it'd be really nice to just illustrate what it is we're talking about here. So I would like to start by turning to Magali Avila. Magali is the Director of the Environmental Governance Program with Proética at the Transparency International chapter in Peru. So Magali, could you kick us off and just give us a highlight, like what is this?
Hello, everyone. Okay, I'm speaking Spanish and Jorge translate me. Thank you, Jorge. Hoy les quiero hablar de cómo un agricultor de hoja de coca se volvió un exitoso empresario y 2 veces gobernador regional.
Today I'm going to speak about how a coca farmer became a very successful businessman and governor in Peru.
Y no es una historia de éxito, sino más bien es una historia de cómo un funcionario público se aprovechó del espacio que él tenía para articular su empresa de palma aceitera, acaparar tierras en la Amazonía y generar destrucción.
This is not a success story, but it's the story of someone who took advantage of his position to traffic land, get undue influence on the business of oil palm in his political career.
Este empresario, este agricultor de hoja de coca, se volvió un gobernador regional en el año 2016, época en la que nosotros hicimos una investigación en la Amazonía sobre tráfico de tierras, deforestación y corrupción.
This coca farmer became in 2016 the governor of the region at a time where we carry out an investigation on his dealings.
La organización criminal operaba a través de la entrega de títulos de propiedad.
His criminal organization operated through the handing of land property titles,
Una propiedad que se consideraba intangible porque son bosques que no pueden ser deforestados.
These titles were handed over a portion of land, a plot of land that was considered intangible or protected because it was an area where there were forests, a protected forest in the Amazon.
Y porque además es territorio de pueblos indígenas.
And in addition to that, it's the home to a number of indigenous peoples.
Entonces esos territorios se le entregaban con estos contratos en serie fraudulentos a supuestos agricultores y estos agricultores a su vez los vendían a una empresa de palma aceitera que deforestó 11.000 hectáreas de bosque amazónico bajo esa modalidad.
How many? ¿Cuántas?
11.000 hectáreas.
So these titles were handed to fake farmers who were given to in fraudulent ways that ended up in deforesting 11,000 acres of hectares of Amazon forest for the purpose of oil palm.
En el primer gobierno regional de esta autoridad, este gobernador legisló a favor de el avance de palma aceitera y el cambio de uso de suelos para favorecer a este tipo de actividad económica.
In his first term as a regional governor, this person used his position of influence to change the zonification of the land from a protected forest for agricultural use for oil palm.
Lo que ahora sabemos es que en el 2016 él también creó 3 empresas de palma aceitera y se favoreció a través de estas normativas que él mismo publicó.
We know now that at the same time he was changing the zonification of this forest, he created 3 companies dedicated to the cultivation of oil palm that ended up that benefited from the laws he himself wrote.
Él actualmente nuevamente ha sido elegido como gobernador regional en la región Ucayali, que es una región amazónica, la región amazónica más grande del Perú.
He was reelected as regional governor in the region of Ucayali, which has a big portion of the Amazon forest in Peru.
Y esta persona lo que hace es ser parte de una entidad pública regional para favorecerse indebidamente del marco normativo que pueda generar a partir de la captura regulatoria que hace siendo autoridad.
So this is a person, a politician who has used his position to capture regulation and enrich himself.
I think we'll have to wrap there, but I think that's a really amazing, unfortunate example of just how power is used in this way. And I think it'd be really great to now zoom out a little bit and contextualize more conceptually what is it that's happening. So I'll ask you, Chelsea. Chelsea Dreher is a senior anti-corruption and research officer with IFES. Chelsea, could you help us just frame this issue a little bit more? Tell us what's happening and what the impacts of it are looking like.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just ask in the audience, are any of you more focused on political finance? Can I see a raise of hands? Is anybody in political finance in the room? Yeah. And then what about on the environment side? Do we have individuals on the environment side? Okay, great. So I'm going to step back a little bit, and I apologize if it's sort of 101 information, but just so we're all on the same page. I think we'll start with what political finance is all about. And when we hear that term, it's about party financing. I'm a loud person, so hopefully you heard all of that. Excellent. Projecting. My drama coach would be very proud from back in preschool. So when we're talking about political finance, there's party finance and there's campaign finance. And I think that we're really in the campaign finance camp when we're talking about this issue of money flowing into politics during electoral cycles. Why is this an issue? We're lacking transparency around who donors are. We're not seeing how much they're giving to elections. And when voters are going to the polls, they're not really able to make an informed choice based on what information is available in a lot of contexts. We're not able to see potential conflicts of interest between individuals, maybe in the private sector who are giving money, and politicians. And so we really do need to work for more political finance transparency in general. There are different types of regulations that can be put in place to varying effects. So some regulations work at that issue of donors, who can give, how much can they give, what do they have to disclose about themselves when they give? Do they have to give you any corporate ownership information? Another category of regulations is really targeted at spending. What can candidates spend on? And then there's a third sort of category of regulations, I would say, which is all about declarations or disclosures of funds. What level of information are political parties giving us? Do they have to provide backup documents? Do we know anything about their bank accounts and what's moving in and out? And I think most importantly, are the reports that are coming in around elections available to the public, and are they available in a timely manner? Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the answer is no. There's really limited understanding about monetary flows. And I think I will give you one example about how complicated this issue is to maybe take it home. So this beautiful graphic pulled from International Ideas Political Finance Database shows us where in the world there are bans on anonymous donations to political parties. So if you are in a country in red, the answer is no. There are no bans on anonymous donations. If you're in a country in pink, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. There are bans on some sorts of donations, generally above a certain financial value. And then in countries in blue, there are bans on anonymous donations. And I think looking at this graphic, it can be a little misleading, because you might think, oh, there's a lot of blue. We're doing okay. The challenge is, even in countries with bans on these sorts of anonymous movements of money into political systems, donors are really good at masking their identity. So they might funnel money through what we call straw donors, nonprofit organizations, for instance, who can legally give to campaigns. Or they might send money through their family members or their friends, or in some really insidious cases, through their employees. So at the end of the day, donors are giving money. They're the ultimate source, but their names are appearing nowhere on financial reports around elections. And the challenge, linking it back to the story we heard earlier, is that companies in the extractive industry, in logging and deforestation, in mining, what have you, are able to take advantage of this. And they're able to sort of hold undue sway over political figures and extract favors down the line, basically. Unfortunately, in some situations, we see politicians pretty blatantly putting up their hands and saying, donate to me, I'll help water down regulations down the line. And that's pretty concerning, and it's not limited to any specific geographic region around the world. It's happening in multiple places. In other places, you have companies maybe approaching politicians, offering them help, and then saying, hey, remember the contribution I gave you? I could use some help. And then in some other cases, it's just the case that elections are incredibly expensive. It's expensive to get on the ballot if there's a lot of intra-party competition. It's expensive to run the campaign. If you live in a context where patronage systems are important, it's expensive to meet those constituent expectations and to stay in office. So political figures might be in a position where they feel they owe something back to the people who are funding them. And that can take lots of different forms. I think we're talking about policy distortion a lot at this conference. Watering down regulations or just killing legislation before it even goes through. But there are other issues to keep an eye out for. I think burying of environmental impact reports or risk assessments showing problematic behaviors from companies. Or it could be that you are skewing how land grants are going through, how licensing and permits are allotted to companies to carry out these activities. Or it could be skewing of tender processes. So a politician's friend's company is the one that gets to carry out the work. Bigger picture, the cost is, it's hurting our democracies. So politicians are now representing their cronies' interests, not their constituents' interests. And I think the real impact, as we'll see from our amazing panel, is on the environment and on human populations, quite frankly, because we have situations where politicians might just be ignoring the pollution that is hurting in our populations. So in the name of time, I'm going to wrap up because I think we have some really great stories that are coming. This is just to show you how far behind we are on some of our global climate targets. I'm not going to go into detail. I think we all know, we're struggling here a little bit. We heard that from our great plenary earlier. So with that, back to you, Nicole, and I think on to the rest of our panel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chelsea. And that was a really quick run through just how challenging this issue is and some of the differentiation between contexts. I mean, I think obviously this involves a range of stakeholders, but I think as you flagged, political parties play a big role in this. And so I'd like to turn to Slobodan Milic. Slobodan is a senior advisor on the political parties team with the National Democratic Institute. Slobodan, with your background, could you just explore a little bit more about how the ways in which political parties are being financed is enabling these dynamics? And then I think what would be fascinating if you could touch on is, what does that mean once they're actually in?
Right. I'm Slobodan. I'm from NDI, and we work with political parties in more than 100 countries around the world, and we do help them with their fundraising, campaign management, trainings with those things. We monitor how they spend money, and does campaign finance sometimes, is it sometimes detrimental to the environment? Yes, it is. Does it always happen? It doesn't always happen. It depends on the context, really. But I gotta tell you that money in politics is always going to be there. It is the bloodline for political parties, and political parties it's very difficult for them to say no to money being offered, because that's very often the difference between winning the elections and losing the elections. And political parties have one job, it's to win the elections. That's the most important objective they have. So there's always going to be money there, and they want it. But then, when does this money become toxic? And I will give you three scenarios. First is when there are extractive industries that are interested in certain countries, be it fossil fuels or mining or even industrial agriculture. Is there a corporate influence over there? If yes, then we have a problem, because these companies have a common strategy of investing in political party campaigns. For them, it's a peanut money, really, and political parties, for them, it's really big money, tens of thousands of dollars. It's a good return on investment, and they're going to continue doing so. The second thing is there a lack of transparency? And as we saw from your slide, there is, in probably majority of the world, there is a lack of transparency. And we are talking about anonymous donations, we're talking about crypto donations in cryptocurrencies, we're talking about corporate loans, where companies give loans to political parties with interest rates that are far better than what we can get from our banks. And after a few years, they even forgive those loans. So these are really corporate donations rather than loans. And then they pay for media advertisement. Sometimes, especially now with social media, you can pay for Facebook advertisement from one country to the other country. There is really no regulation to follow these things. And then the third category is whether or not the parties are mature, whether or not parties would be willing to take short-term economic gain over long-term environmental stability. So why do they do so? Well, parties are, and I'm going to tell you something that most people would not agree with me. I think that parties are rational actors. And they want to go from point A to point B in the shortest amount of time and space. So for them, if a company comes in and says, here's the money for your campaign, and this, we bring jobs, yes, there may be environmental cost, but we bring jobs. It's very difficult for the party not to say yes to it because they have constituencies and they know that the jobs are the most important thing in elections. It's number one topic. Still, even in Pennsylvania, in the mining towns where people used to live 50, 60 years working in the coal pits, if you ask people who live there, they want to open coal pits because they want to have better salaries more than better health, right? So political parties are listening to it and they're responding to it. So I will stop there to give chance to the others, but hopefully later on we will get back to some solutions rather than staying on the problems.
Thank you. Thanks, Slobodan. And I think one of the things that we're interested in and can come out maybe more in the discussion is what this does to the way governance is done. And I'd like to now bring Tim Steele in. Tim is the chief of the field support section in the corruption and economic crime branch with UNODC. Tim, it'd be really fascinating to get your view about what dynamics, what challenges tend to emerge when you're trying to partner with governments to work on environmental corruption, where politicians and parties have drawn resources in this way.
Thanks, Nicola. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Maybe I'll start with a quick example then.
Your microphone is
Okay.
Your microphone.
I think someone is supposed to come and help.
Can I borrow? Is that working now?
Yeah.
Okay. I was obviously meant to be silenced. A few years back, a report was circulated in Kenya called the Cattle Barons, and it outlined an interesting scheme whereby cattle grazers were being relocated clean across the country to a northern area and granted lands in protected areas. They're national parks and buffer zones. Those buffer zones were being given to these grazers. Purpose? At that point, party politics split along tribal lines. They were moving people into constituencies which the ruling party could win if they increased the number of votes. So basically, purely actually moving people several hundred kilometers to obtain votes. Interestingly, in terms of the work we're doing on an ongoing basis, the place we see political interference most is actually fisheries, of all the areas. It's curious. We do corruption risk assessment with a lot of environmental agencies, generally with the wildlife or the forestry agencies. There will be some implementation, some buy-in. The fisheries, no, absolutely not. Really quite heavy pushback, and really quite blunt pushback. I mean, the most extreme example was one southern African country where we developed a set of recommendations for preventing corruption in the fisheries sector, sitting on the minister's desk, waiting for signature for 4 months. Still waiting for signature because unfortunately the minister was arrested for doing one of the things we were recommending should be prevented. But last, and so working, you know, there's always that block, there's always that benefit. Two more things from my experience, which are not directly related to the environment, but highlight the problem we sit up with. First one was ANC government came in, wonderful time, mid-late 90s in South Africa. About 97, 98, I had the head of the provincial ANC in my kitchen saying, Tim, do you know where we can get some money from? We're absolutely broke. So there's Liberation Party, a big party. Second one, sitting in an East African country with a group of governors and deputy governors who explained how much it costs to get elected. And then pointed out that if they maximised salary and all allowances they got per diems, they would fall about $20,000 a year short. So they had to make the money up somewhere. The point is, very often, raiding the environment is a low-hanging fruit, or letting someone raid the environment is a low-hanging fruit. So you have to make up your $20,000 a year, and you get elected to make money. What do? You raid the fruit.
Thank you, Tim. I think a really fascinating set of interventions here and helping us sort of frame the parameters and I think just how tricky some of these are. But I think also interesting to hear a little bit about the differentiation between the sort of sectors. We want to now have a little go back to look at how this is playing out in context and the sort of different implications that it draws out. And so I'm going to come back to you, Magali. Proética has done a lot of work, you know, and I think you started to touch upon this around palm oil as a factor in campaign finance. Can you tell us can we just go back to this conversation and tell us a little bit more about what this looks like? And I know you were starting to talk about this, but the impacts this has had on indigenous people in this context.
Gracias por tu pregunta. Básicamente, el impacto de la corrupción y del vínculo perverso que existe entre la deforestación y la violación de derechos humanos es ¿no? Sí. Es la degradación de los territorios, pero también de los modos de vida de la población indígena y no solamente el impacto es para ellos, sino es para el ecosistema en general, ¿no?
Thank you very much for the question. The impact of corruption and violation of human rights is on the ecosystems that we lose as a result of these linkages.
Y aunque se piensa que esta es una actividad, o que se puede pensar que esta es una actividad local con el ejemplo que yo he dado, en realidad el financiamiento que viene de esta empresa de palma aceitera es un financiamiento de capital transnacional. Es un financiamiento de empresarios que han incorporado finanzas de Estados Unidos y de capitales europeos también.
So in spite the story is very local, the financing of the industry that sped up this licensing of land was international financing. It was mostly US investors that put money into the business.
Y la palma aceitera que sale de nuestro territorio en la Amazonía es vendida a empresas grandes, a grandes empresas como Nestlé y otras, ¿no?
And it is big companies such as Nestlé that buy the palm oil that is produced in these formerly protected areas of the Amazon forest in Peru.
La consecuencia directa es que hay una pugna por los territorios de los pueblos indígenas, los pueblos amazónicos.
The consequence is that now these the territories of these Amazonian peoples indigenous peoples are under pressure.
Los despojan de sus territorios y cuando estas personas que son defensores ambientales porque están defendiendo sus territorios presentan denuncias, los terminan asesinando.
They are dispossessed of their land or their territory, and when they challenge through legal means, they end up murdered.
Por ahí.
Thank you. Really unbelievable impacts at the community level, and I think another context where that's the case is in the Philippines. So I'd like to ask Beverly Basmanos to reflect on this. Beverly is the national coordinator for Bantay Kita, which is a Publish What You Pay chapter in the Philippines. And moving away from palm oil, I know Bantay Kita has done a lot of work connecting the dots between campaign finance and the mining sector. So if you could tell us a little bit more about the nature and the scale of that relationship, and also I think what legacy that's left on the political system would be really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. With the increased demand for transition minerals, our government has projected an increase of 190 new mining projects within the next 4 years. The Philippines is the second largest producer of nickel in the world. And with the foreseen increase in demand, a new House bill was being proposed by the government that reduces revenue shares from mining. And the proposed bill will facilitate widespread mining investments, all in favor of the mining sector and notwithstanding the current industry's impacts that led to the widespread human rights violations, loss of local livelihoods, and destruction of critical ecosystems that affect the water and food security of indigenous and local communities in the Philippines. So with these issues, we started looking at the drivers of the environmental destruction in the country. So there was a case study we conducted in 2018 that attempted to profile the campaign donors of legislators and identify the links of legislators to the mining sector. The study also tried to understand the level of entrenchments of mining firms in the legislative sector, which can be analyzed in terms of candidates' dependence on their contributions, and to determine any indication of legislative bargaining. The data gathering used available public data to profile individual campaign donors, and where mining firms' owners are identified into the level of natural persons. Constraints make it unrealistic to perfectly determine the links between the mining and campaign donors. The direct links can be best identified through the full statement of assets, liabilities, and net worth of the political candidates, which the research attempted but failed to acquire given the extremely inaccessible process. And the indirect links are also challenging to determine given the lack of available public information or simply the difference in surnames. So the study highlighted that in campaign finance, contributions legislators received are linked only to individual level profiles without information about what corporations they own, are working with, or affiliated with. So reforms have to be done to ensure that the ban on corporate donations is not being circumvented. So the research also recognizes that more to campaign finance has to be analyzed to substantiate claims that the decisions of certain senators are completely dictated by the mining firms that finance their campaign. So another study was conducted to look into beneficial ownership, which reveals the link of two mining companies of the incumbent Speaker of the House of the Philippines. And the Speaker of the House is actually a cousin of our president. Although the paper trail finds that no name or no Romualdez, that's the name of the politician, is named as beneficial owner, but the study reveals that the family has a considerable level of control in the mining firms, as evidenced by the presence of the family members and close allies in several firms, across the ownership claim, the interconnectedness of the management, and the link of the family with the networks and the flow of influence throughout the years. So then the running, it was also discussed a while ago that the running an election is very expensive, and also in the country. And if you look at the 2016 election, the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism estimated over $34 million campaign expenditures of the 51 senators, and 86% of this are expenditures supported by the contributions. And if you look at the local level, at the current situation right now, we can see the direct link of our small-scale miners and who are becoming our local politicians, and our politicians who are into mining or financing mining in the Philippines. So the problem right now is we have communities impacted by these mining operations who are also voting the same politicians that are actually promoting destruction of the environment because of lack of information of all these expenditures in mining.
Thank you, Ron. I think shows how this issue intersects multiple levels, and I think another context where that's the case is in Indonesia, and so I'd like to turn now to Aled Williams. Aled is a principal researcher at U4, and timely for us, recently released a book on the politics of deforestation and REDD+ in Indonesia. Aled, a lot of work, including the work you've done, has made these connections between agribusiness, forestry, and local level politics and political processes in Indonesia. How does that work, and what have the impacts been? What does that look like, particularly, for example, for biodiversity, for nature loss?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So before I go to Indonesia, I'd just like to reiterate the point that this, I think, is an issue across, all geographies essentially, and many different regime types. If any of you follow Welsh politics at the moment, you'll know that there's an ongoing case involving our First Minister, which is of concern. But as you mentioned, so my focus over the past 10 years has really been trying to understand the impact of anti-deforestation programs in Indonesia at the provincial level, so with fieldwork in central Sulawesi. I came across some great work which has been done by Indonesian journalists in collaboration with their British and American colleagues, which really reveals sort of the connections between political finance and deforestation at the provincial level. I think it's important to recognize that we're in a structural moment in which many countries are aspiring to graduate to upper middle income economy status, and Indonesia is one of them. At the same time as with this triple nature crisis, there's a lot of financing and projects going into these countries. The economic plans of many of these countries, including Indonesia, rely heavily on extractive and export-oriented models. So there's an inherent contradiction between these two trajectories. So the project I'm talking about, and there's a slide there which illustrates what I'm discussing, is a project by the Gecko Project and Monga Bay called Indonesia for Sale. So if we go back to the beginning of Indonesia's democratic period, which is called the Reformasi, elected district chiefs were given quite considerable powers to lease out land under their jurisdictions. And that led to a surge in plantation agriculture and major deforestation. So the journalists looked particularly at a district called Sarawak on Borneo, and they identified a district head called Dawan Ali, who had previously been an active business representative, protesting, for example, the banning of companies for bidding for government projects due to corruption. In 2004-2005, Dawan issued 37 licenses to oil palm companies covering an area more than 80 times the size of Manhattan, which gives you some sense of the scale. And that's illustrated in the map there. So what the journalists did was, very cleverly, they pieced together this story behind this licensing spree based on stock exchange information, government permit databases, company deeds, and they uncovered a really elaborate plan to establish shell companies and names of Dawan's relatives and associates, and endow them with licenses for thousands of hectares of land and then sell them on to big firms. So how do we know about this? Well, there was a whistleblower that came forward in this case, and the whistleblowing led to an investigation by the country's anti-corruption agency, the KPK, but the investigation never led to a prosecution. Why was that? Well, under Indonesian law, the easiest way to prosecute a corrupt official is to actually catch them in the act of accepting a bribe, usually after some form of surveillance like wiretapping. And that never happened in this case, and so there was never a prosecution, even though in similar cases where there was an indication that this had occurred, there have been prosecutions. So I think the implications of this in terms of political finance abuse and environmental destruction are quite clear. So, and it's a familiar story from other places, as we're hearing in other contexts. So the point is that this basically incentivizes, the money here involved incentivizes a quid pro quo deal between politicians and businesses that are interested in certain decisions being made in their favor after the election. So if the candidates are selling decisions about what happens to vast tracts of forest land, for example, or to other resources like marine resources, this leads to immense environmental destruction. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Aled. I mean, I think something that's come out here and strikes me, but also from as a sort of question, I suppose, also from what you were saying, Bon and Magali, is sort of how close is this relationship, and getting to the heart of that is really tricky. I'd like to bring in Maurice Nyambe. Maurice is the Executive Director of Transparency International in Zambia, and TI Zambia has done these investigations that have made connections at quite high levels in the illegal rosewood trade. So it'd be interesting to get your view with that sort of prism and that experience about how financing to politics in this trade has sort of come together, and what the impacts have been, given your work and given just how high and how far-reaching this is.
Well, thank you so much, Miko. Am I audible?
Yes.
Great. Thanks a lot, Miko, and very pleased to be part of this very important conversation. I think this is a conversation that we need to keep having because of the importance of what we're talking about today. The story of the rosewood tree in Zambia, and if I may, I would like to refer to it by its local name, which is Mukula. The story of the Mukula tree trade in Zambia is a very sad one. And it is sad for many reasons, and it is actually an ongoing concern because it is still happening. Now, of course, the Mukula tree is a protected species under CITES, and so any trade to do with that particular species, it has to get special authorization from the state or from the government. And actually, as things stand now, there is a ban on trading in Mukula, but as I'm going to show later, this has been ignored with impunity, if I may say that. So back in 2019, which is about 5 years ago, the Environmental Investigative Agency did a study which really showed that there was illicit harvesting as well as export of the Mukula tree, despite the ban which was in effect. And this trade was actually linked to very high-ranking government officials, including 2 cabinet ministers and the daughter of the former president, who was still in office back then. And so there was an estimated $7.5 million in illicit revenues that was raised from this illegal trade. Now, a subsequent investigation that we did as TI Zambia actually showed, and this was in 2021, which was 2 years after the EIA investigation, it showed, first of all, that the trade was still rife, it was still rampant, and that the illegality was still going on. Now, the reason why all this matters, and the reason why this is a growing concern, it is now and it was even back then, is that our investigation clearly showed that the proceeds of this illegal activity, the proceeds of this illegal trade, were actually used or channeled to fund the campaign activities of the then ruling party back then in the 2021 elections. And that is why this was a very big concern for us. Now, over the last few years, what we have seen happen in Zambia is that there has been an astronomical rise, if I may call it that, in the influence of money on elections. I think Chelsea did hint at the fact that elections are costly, or doing campaigns is a very costly endeavor. But it seems in the last, maybe within the last 10 years or so, this has become ever so apparent within our context in Zambia. And so what was very clear from both our investigation and the EIA investigation is that politicians will not shy away from illicit environmental activities or illegal environmental activities in order to fund their political activities, and that is where the connection actually is. And so this risk is there, and it's always there because of the nature of politics, because of the cost of politics. But where there's even a lack of legislation to regulate political party financing or to regulate campaign financing, the risk is exacerbated, and the environment, sadly, bears the brunt of a lot of this risk. So I think it is a big concern, and a concern that is still ongoing. Now, let me touch on what this has done in terms of the impact on the environment itself, on biodiversity. What we have seen happen over the last several years, or over the last few years, is that the Mukula species is actually getting depleted in certain parts of Zambia. For example, in the eastern part of Zambia, because what has happened over the last few years is that the illegal trade has sort of moved. It is now happening a lot in the northwestern part of the country, as well as in the western part of the country, where the illegal trade is actually happening still now. So there is a very clear impact on the environment itself, but also even on local communities. If you want to talk about the cultural connections that they have, to the forest and all the rest of it. If you want to talk about the soil degradation that happens, so the impact on the environment and on the local communities is very clear. And so this shows really the concern that exists around this illegal trade, and it's one really that has continued to preoccupy our minds, and a lot of our advocacy efforts as an organization are going towards dealing with that.
Thank you. You've all shared a pretty daunting set of challenges. And I think now we want to shift gears and start to think about what are the potential pathways out of these various messes. So I want to come back to you, Bon, and just get a sense from your experience. Give us your best advice. What do we need to be doing? Is it differently? Is it more of to start to incentivize, to create incentives to change some of these pernicious patterns?
Well, in the context of the Philippines, I'm working closely with local communities impacted by mining. It's difficult because the people that we are also helping to capacitate to assert their rights are the same people who vote for bad politicians because they don't know. So I think one important thing that we need to do in our own context, and I don't know, maybe in other countries, is to invest on political literacy, like educating voters, especially now what I see after the previous election in the Philippines and the current administration's election before, what we see is maybe there's still hope with the young people, because we can no longer. It's difficult to educate the old guys. Maybe there is hope with the youth. So to invest in capacitating, training, giving political education to our youth, and I really hope that the international partners and funders would really give support for civil society helping these communities.
Thank you. I'm going to pose the same question to you, Maurice. These are really sensitive dynamics, not easy to change, and I think some of these trade-offs are also really challenging. What's your advice? What's a good starting point? How do we start to change these vested interests?
Well, first of all, I think the discourse has to continue in order for us to sort of bring out new ways of engaging and new ways of dealing with this. But two specific maybe points that I would like to raise. And the first is probably a message to myself as a CSO activist and CSOs in general. I think that as CSOs, we need to probably become better at highlighting in very clear and compelling ways the connection between environmental crimes and campaign financing and everything and all the negativity that brings. I think this calls for us as CSOs to become better at our research, to become better at basically more innovative ways of advocating, because I think if we are to sort of carry the masses and to carry the citizenry, we need to actually show that connection in a very compelling way that is actually going to ensure that we have a larger mass of advocacy, if you like, concerning this issue. But related to that, and the second point is that I think that there needs to be a lot more transparency in political party and campaign financing in order to, basically to limit the flow of what I can call dirty money within the political landscape. And this is money also that is coming from illicit environmental activities, as we have seen. So obviously this calls for, maybe thorough legislative reforms that can then be put in place. We have been doing as an organization a lot of advocacy around, getting issues of campaign and political financing regulated by law in Zambia. And that it's a battle that we've been waging for quite a while, and I don't know if we are very close to winning it, but it's a battle that basically we are continuing. So I think there is something to be said about making the legal side of things or the legislative side of things a lot more potent in terms of it regulating the flow of money within our politics. And I think with those two specific interventions, we'll probably begin to see ourselves making the sort of progress that we know we can make even in fighting this.
Thank you, Maurice. Just picking up on your first recommendation, I'm going to switch it around a little bit and I think come to you, Aled, putting on your researcher hat. This is a big landscape, and I think there's still, to your first point, there's a lot we don't know about how this works, and certainly about the type of change pathways that might be effective. What would be a sort of your call to the evidence community? Where should we start? Where are those sort of key gaps we need to fill?
Yeah, so I think that we know from the cases presented here and many others that we know. So we know abuse of political finance is facilitating environmental destruction in many places. So we also know that there are a lot of efforts underway to reform political finance and to campaign finance and implement change. So at the same time, we also know from an evidence point of view that those political finance reforms and campaign finance reforms are contested and also abused in different contexts in different ways. So I think what we need to know more about is what is the evidence in terms of how that is happening, and what innovations are then needed in order to overcome those abuses and contestations themselves. So I think that when we're thinking about workable solutions, we have to look at the specific context in which this is occurring. So in one place, political parties might form part of the solution. In other contexts that I've been looking at with colleagues, political parties have become less important over recent decades. Political candidates act more as free agents, shopping around between political parties. The bounds of ideology don't really fit anymore. So then we can question whether political parties are the right place to start, or whether we should start somewhere else. But I think that the forms of collective action that we need to overcome this kind of contestations and abuse should start from the context in which we're looking at. But I think there are some innovative methods out there that I'm hearing about. So there is an example from Brazil that was shared with me recently about AI being used to generate automatic social media posts of infringements by parliamentarians of hospitality rules. So a fairly kind of minor issue in the larger scheme of things, but creating a kind of a social shaming effect for parliamentarians who were, so whenever they overspent their hospitality or misused their hospitality budget, automatically there would be a social media post going out detailing what they'd done. And obviously that's a cost for politicians, and politicians don't want costs. They want success. So at the same time as that innovative method was really struggling with sustainability of financing. So I think financing of these solutions is obviously important. And that's only one element, probably in a much bigger picture of different things that need to be done to get the right incentives in place. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Aled. Salban, I'll come back to you. We've started to hear some ideas about what maybe some entry points are. Looking again through this prism of parties, and I think there's this question from a research perspective, if that's the starting point, but you've worked in many contexts with parties. What's going to get them to change this? We've talked about this being low-hanging fruit. Yeah. What are the options?
Well, that's my objective. This is why I came to this conference, to look for solutions and to go back to political parties and really offer it to them. And I will give you 3 groups of solutions that I found just by listening people around in these different groups. But the main question here is, why would the political parties implement any of these solutions? Why would they do it? This is the main question, because sooner or later someone needs to go into the room with political parties and say you should do this and that and that. And then what's in it for them? Because these are the rational actors. This is my point. They're rational actors. They're not going to do things just because they sound nice. So I would like the audience to help me by asking me, as soon as I tell you what the group solution is, you should ask me, why would they do it? My first group of solutions is about transparent donation policies. We've been hearing about it, disclosing all the sources, regular public reports, not only in the election period, but in the whole election cycle, ethical guidelines for accepting donations. Now, the key question is, why should they do it, right? We don't have the answer yet. There is no evidence that disclosing your finances is going to result in electoral success. And this is important. If we don't have the evidence, parties are not going to do it. So we at NDI, we want to dig a bit deeper. We want to go into the databases of VDEM. I don't know if you heard about VDEM from the University of Göteborg. They have a database of all the data with elections and political parties. Okay, the second group of solutions, making sustainable political parties. So political parties practicing sustainability in their daily work by being, conscious about printing, minimizing waste, reducing energy consumption, but also parties doing environmental or sustainable advocacy, right? We think that by doing this, they're going to be less likely to accept dirty money, because it's a big leap, right? If you're having progressive policies, but then accepting dirty money, it's very difficult to bridge that gap. The key question is, why would they do it, right? Why would they do it? Again, we don't have evidence that this is going to result in electoral success. We think that they're going to be more competitive by being more sustainable, that young people, as you mentioned, they look at these things, they look which parties are more sustainable, but again, we don't have evidence. And finally, the third group of solutions is about participatory political parties. We want political parties to involve citizens in policy making, especially if it pertains to campaign financing. We want them to allow citizens to advocate internally within the party for responsible policies. Now, why do we want this? Because we think that inclusive parties, really inclusive parties, are less likely to accept dirty money. This is what we think. Now, the mother of all questions, why would they do it? Well, for this one, we actually do have evidence. There was a recent research that we did in Ecuador together with the London School of Economics and the University of Virginia, where this is going to be very short. We asked one major political party in Ecuador to reach out to 3,000 voters divided in 3 groups. Group 1, they are going to ask voters to take part in the policy-making process. within the political party. Group 2, they only sent their already made platforms for feedback. They asked the citizens, just give us the feedback on this platform. And the group 3 was a control group. The results, the group 1 that took part in policy making overwhelmingly wanted to vote for this political party, to join, to donate, right? Just because they were part of policy-making process. Even the group 2 that was just asked for feedback, even them showed the great results. They wanted to join the party, vote for the party. So they don't ask for much, just to be consulted. So what we're trying to tell these parties, if they involve citizens in decision-making process, they will have electoral success. And this is a good selling point, and with that, I'm going to finish this.
Thank you. I think that this is a nice segue to my last sort of question in this round, which is to you, Tim. I like this frame of why would they do it, and I think we all need to be asking that, quite frankly, a lot more, because we can come up with ideas that we would all be happy to do, but I think there's a whole constituency of actors that we're trying to influence that there's no rational reason for them to do it. So Tim, I'm keen to think about what the role is of sort of the global policy space. We have coming up next year the UN Convention Against Corruption, Conference of State Parties. It is, on the cards that there may be discussions there, both on political finance as well as on environmental corruption. I'd love to get your views sort of on that, or sort of that or related policy opportunities to create some convergence across this space. And then I think it'd be good to get your sense of is there an opportunity, can policy leverage some of these incentives? Is policy, global policy, these global policy forms part of the story for why should they do it? Does it help to change any of that calculus?
Okay. You'll have seen me fiddling with my phone. I promise I wasn't looking at the cricket score. I was actually finding something. I will read you. UNCAC, United Nations Convention Against Corruption, Article 7.3. Each state party shall also consider taking appropriate legislative and administrative measures consistent with the objectives of this convention and in accordance with the fundamental principles of its domestic law, to enhance transparency in the funding of candidatures for elected public office, and where applicable, the funding of political parties. So there you have a global standard sitting there. Now, you mentioned the Conference of State Parties. To put it in a very simplistic way, resolutions are an opportunity to actually build on the existing standard, for state parties to commit yet further. Already, as we've gone through the review of implementation of this article of UNCAC, a lot of countries have got recommendations, okay? Largely around increasing transparency in either domestic or foreign funding. Now, particularly the foreign funding is one where there may well be a strong incentive, because you may not want to actually lose control of your country to foreign interest groups. But in terms of the process and in terms of the linkage, I think we've got to be very cautious. There's definitely discussion of potential resolutions on political party financing. There's discussion of potential resolutions on corruption and crimes that impact the environment in some form. I've personally noticed, I'm probably not the only one, I'm not that good at noticing things, but in the last few years, I've personally noticed that negotiations have got increasingly difficult. And so whatever is done would need to be very carefully nuanced. Whether you can address some of the political financing issues through an environmental resolution, or whether some of the environmental issues through a political finance resolution, needs to be carefully discussed. I think both amongst civil society players, but also importantly with the state parties, because the state parties will need to negotiate. One advantage I see potentially coming is the Global South is engaging increasingly in a proactive way in UNCAC negotiations. I think for some of those negotiators there is actually quite a strong incentive on the environment, and there may well be a strong incentive on political finance. But you have to find the incentives, you have to find something that may take us a step forward, may not be everything we want, but I think there may be an opportunity to find something that may take us one or two steps forward and get us nearer to the goal. But first up, have a look at which countries have got recommendations and basically ask them, have you implemented these recommendations? It's out there, public domain. Okay, it's probably enough for now.
Super. Thank you, Tim. So we've heard, I think, a wealth of ideas, which is brilliant. I'd like to now ask Chelsea to come back in and do sort of the hard work of summing us up and giving us a sense of what are the main recommendations. And I think what would be interesting to also highlight is, we can go back to your original map, but what does this look like in different types of operating environments? Which of these recommendations are going to, work in different contexts?
Absolutely. I think I would just react first to this discussion about resolutions, and I thought that was a really important point, reflecting particularly on 7.3 in the UN Convention Against Corruption, which does call for campaign finance transparency, but it doesn't go into detail, and it's not obligatory for state parties. It's more recommended. So, building out actual more universal standards, or minimum standards, I should say, could go a long way in helping set frameworks for states to draw on in this matter, to set an expectation. But I wanted to return to the point that context matters, which I think you mentioned very strongly and clearly in your remarks, Aled. And just coming out of the conversation, I hear a lot of different questions we could be asking if we're just considering intervening or trying to take on this issue to start. So to your point, Magali, about the very real security risks and consequences that stakeholders fighting against political corruption or economic degradation might face. I think the first question we want to ask is, what are the risks? Who can safely engage? If it's not us at the ground level, are there others that we could reach out to? Are there international partners we could work with? Are there regional groups of journalists or NGOs that we could look to? Another question, going back to your point, Beverly, about limited data, is just what is the state of open data and access to information in the context where you're working? Is that something sequencing-wise that we should be working on before we're able to really practically push at this issue? To the point about, lack of regulation, monitoring and enforcement. Why is that happening? Is it a political will issue? Is there limited resourcing for these oversight institutions? Or is it just a lack of technical know-how or capacity? I think that's a question to ask up front to really do that causal analysis. And then I think a last question I would ask is, who's already engaged and who's not engaged in this issue? And how can we get to that other target population? Is it through the human stories? Is it through showing photos of the environmental impact? There has to be a way to tap into that somehow. But reflecting again, just on the conversation we've had, I heard a lot of common themes around challenges. So lack of political will across the board. You might face that in particularly strong one-party systems or in more authoritarian environments, right? Depending on who can safely intervene, I think there were a lot of different solutions that came up. To your point, Beverly, investing in political literacy, and I think you mentioned, Maurice, this idea of mass mobilization, getting a broader swath of society involved could help build that bottom-up pressure. But maybe you need that to be coupled with top-down pressure. So maybe it's reaching out to existing monitoring organizations like the EITI. It's not rolling off my tongue with the jet lag that I'm facing.
End of the night. So
Thank you.
There.
But just, there are groups out there that are working on this issue anyways. So feeding ground level information up to increase top-down pressure could be another route for shifting political incentives. And I would say, just to the point, that a lot of these countries are trying to graduate from lesser developed economies is there a business case to be made here? Can we frame this argument about better, corporate practices and corporate transparency in a different light and make an economic case for reform? I think some creative thinking on that front could be really warranted and could help take the pressure off in terms of risks around engaging on political corruption more directly. I think it's also important to come back and hit on this issue of the costs of politics, right? It's incredibly expensive. Or if you're in a situation where patronage networks are particularly common, how do you intervene? The expectation is for some sort of kickback or for some sort of support for your political official. So there's expectations on both sides, from elected office, from the citizens. So maybe we work with our partners in the corruption sphere that are really investing in social norms and behavioral change and campaigning and messaging around corruption that doesn't reinforce the idea that corruption is normal, everybody should get in on it because why not? Everybody's benefiting from it. To maybe have more nuanced framing around corruption issues. It could also just, if you have high costs of elections, come down to making the case that there's a real human cost and environmental cost. And I think we've seen a lot of really amazing artwork out there, documentaries out there, photography out there, journalistic stories out there that get to the heart of the matter and sort of bring this nebulous issue of political corruption, money, and politics, which is so intangible, down to the human impact level. And that could be another way to shift incentives. And then last but not least, if you're in more of a fragile environment, you're facing security with security challenges, just again, thinking about collective action that goes beyond your borders might be the next best step. Looking at our panel, looking out at the audience and those of you I know out there, I can say very confidently, we all have different networks. We all have partners that we can reach out to. We all have different tools, trainings, technical capacities. So maybe it's a question of finding the right combinations of our organizations to tackle this issue from different fronts, because I can guarantee that we're facing multiple challenges, from political will to lack of resourcing in a lot of these contexts. And I think it's going to take more of a collective response to address that. So those are my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts as well. And to that end, Nicole, I'm going to pass back to you.
Yeah, that was incredibly succinct, and I think you captured so many different ideas, and I think it really helps also to have given us that contextualization, give some sort of menu of options, given that we face myriad challenges, that context is sort of king or queen. We were going to originally do a sort of Menti and get your views, but there's not a lot of views, so I think we'd really like to sort of open it up for discussion and hear ideas if anyone wants to share. Happy to have questions and answers. And I think the other thing we would say, and I already see some hands, which is brilliant, we would love your thoughts too. I don't think anybody's found the silver bullet here, fantastic ideas, but we're also trying to find some recommendations in a set of thorny issues. So very welcome also. So I saw a hand here and here, and I don't know, do we have a mic? And please just say who you are.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for the panel, and I'm sorry I came in a couple minutes late. So if you've already answered this, please just tell me. But I work as a reporter based in Kenya, but reporting mostly across sub-Saharan Africa. And hearing the case study about Zambia really resonated because there is so much there's so much financing of election campaigns backed by precious resource exploitation, and I've seen that in many of the countries that I've worked in. My question for you is, in this case, how did you get the tangible evidence that you needed to draw these connections? Because I think the difficult part about proving this is that this money is dirty and it is hidden, and oftentimes it literally will be in a suitcase that is passed from one person to another in the back of a car somewhere. In many of these contexts, which seems old-fashioned, but that's actually how it goes sometimes. So given all of those considerations, what did you need in order to prove this? And what would you recommend for reporters like me who might be looking to unearth similar stories in other countries when we're looking into investigation?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We had another question.
Hello, I represent the association Watchdog Poland from the neighboring country, and we are watchdog organization, so we do a lot of monitoring, and our members have done a lot of monitoring of election campaigns as well, and financing the election campaigns. And I would like to say that thanks to our work, those registers of donations are now like public information in Poland. But my question is about solutions, and I would like to know your opinion about this solution we have in our country, which I believe is not very unique. I believe there are many countries that have similar system, where the election campaigns are actually financed by the state money. And what's your opinion if it's a good solution? Because in Poland we have quite strict law about donating to the political parties, and only physical persons, like private persons, can donate, and only in a quite small amount. You cannot donate more than like 5,000 euro. So this money that comes from like private donors, it's not very crucial to the political parties, but this money that they get after the election as a compensation from the state money, this is something important for them. And if, in your opinion, it is something that reduces the possibility of corruption, or it doesn't matter actually? Well, thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting question. And we have one more.
Hello, I'm Alina. I'm from the Countering Environmental Corruption Practitioners Forum. And I was wondering, like, we heard several challenges, and what of these challenges that we heard would be illegal corruption? Because we can think about violations of laws that exist, but also thinking in relation to practices that are actually legal. And how would this, change the approach?
Okay, so I think 3 really good questions about the distinction between what's sort of legal versus not illegal, and what that means. Question on, how you get evidence, really tricky issues, and I think that links back to some of the points you were making, Chelsea and Bon, about working in really opaque environments as well. And then, question about election campaign finance coming from the state, and what thoughts are there. So maybe I'll start with you, Maurice, to touch on this question about how you got evidence. But if there are other colleagues, Bon or Magali in particular, it'd be great to hear from you too.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant question. In our case, basically, what we did, maybe 2 or 3 things I can say in response to that. The first is that we already knew from the study that the EIA did about how the funds that were being raised from the illicit environmental crimes that was going on were actually being channeled into political party activities. But so it was sort of put in a very broad sense that way. So when we did our own study, which was in 2021, just ahead of the 2021 elections, I don't know if I should say we were naughty, but we did reach out to the ruling political party then, but not to, I would say, the conventional members of that party. So basically we reached out to the candidates who lost the primary elections. Because obviously they had a lot to say about what was going on. So those are some of the sort of approaches and tactics that we used. And of course, we actually got inside information as to how some of the sources of the finances came through and things like that. So for us, it sort of validated what the EIS study showed, in the sense that it sort of made it a lot more focused where those resources were going, instead of just saying they went to finance the activities of this political party. party, it was actually very clear that in the 2021 elections in particular, a lot of those illicit resources actually funded those parties. And if you were in if you had happened to be in Zambia around that time, it would have been very clear to you in terms of, if you looked at the sheer amount of hard cash and money that was in the hands of just ordinary political cadres. I mean, if you do a quick search on social media, you will see videos of, just ordinary political party cadres sleeping on beds full of money and just things like that. So it was like shoved in our faces that, these guys have got money, and basically it showed that this is where the money was coming from. But also maybe just to close off on that, I said earlier on that this case is actually in court right now as we speak. And some of the evidence that is being adduced or deduced in this case, it is actually pointing to exactly this, and it is validating what actually our research showed, which is that a lot of this money actually was used to finance the activities of the then ruling party in terms of their election campaigns. So those are some of the ways that we did our research. And also maybe just to finally, you asked about what advice maybe I would have for media people like you. I think my advice is that you should, keep this within the public discourse. Like, don't let it die. Because as long as it is in public discourse and people are talking about it and bringing out these specific elements, there's a greater likelihood that, we'll sort of find the solution ultimately. But yeah, those are some of the strategies that we use to get that.
Thank you, Maurice. Bon and Magali working, on sort of with communities, how, and also in contexts where there is maybe quite challenging. How have you dealt with this issue of sort of getting evidence? What would you maybe recommend?
Oh, well, in the case of the Philippines, I've been, it's dangerous. The journalist, the one that was talking in one of the panel this morning, we were talking with my other colleague and we were saying, that Filipina journalist is very strong, like she's really popular in the Philippines, but it's better for her because somehow they have funds to protect them in terms of, like their security while they talk bad against the politicians. But for other NGO workers like us, and when we start, like looking into information and digging information and starting to talk about against our politicians who are actually, some of them are also the minors. When we start doing these things, then with the present situation in the country, it's really, really dangerous. And I don't know how are we going to do that in a way that we can also be protecting ourselves and also our families. So I think there are a lot of tools available because of technology. There are exchange of information from other countries. There are tools available to get information and do those things. But again, context-wise, how are you going to do that in a way that you are also protected? So again, there's a big issue of funding security or giving security fund for, are there available things like that for local civil society to do investigations? We know a lot of things, but we don't want to publish it. We don't want to say it without an evidence. The best way that we can actually do is just to educate local communities and let the community talk. It's safer for them because they can deliver a lot of votes. So somehow they can do, they can make a difference. But again, it's one thing that is also, I think, very good to do is to strengthen the linkage of journalists and grassroots workers like us, so then we can be able to work together and maybe do change.
Thank you. Magali, did you, I know in Peru, environmental human rights defenders, it's not an easy path. How do you investigate these issues safely or get the information you might need?
Yeah. Para el caso de Perú, nosotros trabajamos en conjunto con periodistas locales.
In the Peruvian case, we work together with local journalists.
Y además hemos generado un algoritmo que es Machine Learning, básicamente, que tiene que ver con cómo podemos predecir la ilegalidad de la madera, para el caso específico de madera ilegal, ¿no? De tala ilegal.
And we have created a machine learning algorithm to predict cases of illegal logging in Peru.
Entonces nos hemos aliado con periodistas y las datas que se han podido trabajar desde diferentes instituciones públicas, las hemos solicitado por solicitud de información y hemos corrido datas en paralelo para verificar la información con este algoritmo, ¿no? A través del algoritmo.
To fit the algorithm, we have, in alliance with these journalists, made freedom of information requests to different state authorities holding public information and to be able for us to be able to make the estimations of predictions, the prediction estimations.
No olvidemos que cuando hablamos de actividades ilegales, los delitos ambientales no circulan solos, ¿no? O sea, no es que vaya cada uno por un camino en específico, sino que se apoyan, se soportan entre sí y junto con la corrupción, ¿no?
Don't forget that these activities are mutually reinforcing with corruption.
Y además de esto, también existe información oficiales del Estado que, a pesar de que no es toda la información que quisiéramos, trabajándola de manera conjunta podemos llegar a generar información real de cuánto volumen se está exportando, me refiero a madera, versus cuánto es la madera que se está sacando de manera legal en el país, ¿no?
Pulling together all these parallel tabulation of information from these efforts with journalists, we can compare this with the government officially held information and find where the mismatch between the official figures and the actual exports of logging timber are in the country.
Y por último, nosotros trabajamos fuertemente con los pueblos indígenas, con las organizaciones indígenas.
We work very closely with indigenous organizations.
Lo que hacemos es acompañarlos en el monitoreo territorial indígena. ¿Esto qué quiere decir? Que acompañamos todo el monitoreo a través de tecnología que les damos, drones, GPS, etcétera, para que puedan ellos evidenciar dónde son las fuentes, georreferenciar y evidenciar dónde son las fuentes de deforestación y qué actividad económica ilegal está causando.
We have a system in working with these indigenous organizations of a system for monitoring indigenous territories with drones and other technologies so that they can detect what activities are taking place in these territories and the levels of deforestation or damage that are being produced.
Entonces es más la evidencia con la información específica que nos dan las poblaciones indígenas y el contraste de la información del Estado más el apoyo con los journalists, generamos como información eficiente y fidedigna, ¿no?
So by pulling these three different sources from state health information, the information produced with the journalists, and the information produced by this monitoring in indigenous territories, give us a lot of confidence about the kind of activities and damage that is being produced.
Thank you. So we're at time now. I think there were still a couple of questions that were really fascinating, and I think we have some panelists who'd be really well suited. Maybe maybe we can have a quick discussion here at the end if people are interested. There's only a few of us to cover those questions of illegal versus illegal, and this question about whether getting financing from the state for campaigns, just I think are really important. The last thing I just want to do is thank all of you for all of your work and on this topic and for this session. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.